Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid Podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. This week's episode is the result of a poll in our Facebook discussion group. In covering Genesis 1 through 3 as we have been so far, I realized that there were some glaring holes in understanding things more fully. This week, we will take a look at the winner of that poll and dive deeper into understanding what is meant by the terms life, death, and the after-death. Why do I not call it the afterlife? More to come on that one. But before I do, I want to both acknowledge and step sideways around the 800-pound gorilla in the room called hell. I say acknowledge because among the topics which cause the most church hurt, we find hell prominently figured. I say step sideways around because I will not be addressing that topic directly today. That will come about in the next podcast episode, which will examine some of the New Testament language about eternal realities. Today's episode will focus almost exclusively on the Old Testament understanding of what life means, what death means, and what happens following death. Along the way, we will certainly glance forward at some ways in which these terms are used throughout the entire scriptures, but I will be focusing on Genesis and the evidence we can either see therein or point forward from there to realities which are given a more solid shape later on. And it is a simple fact that unless you are reading out of a King James Bible, you will not find the word hell in the Old Testament. This shocks a lot of people when they discover this. What? Isn't the whole point of the Bible to tell us where we go when we die and how to get our fire insurance? If there's one theme on this podcast, it is that perspective, as prevalent and common as it is, fundamentally misunderstands the scriptures and tradition. And because of this has been the soil out of which much church hurt and painful experiences have grown. And what I hope to do here today, as with all episodes of this podcast, is to reconstruct a different vision of the scriptures, one that is sensitive to the hurting, aimed at theology that doesn't hurt. So, what will we be talking about? This episode will focus on the afterdeath, as I'm calling it, through the lens of the ancient authors and audiences we have been spending time with so far. We'll be picking up from the Genesis 1 through 3 narrative we've been marinating in the past month or so, and fleshing out the concept of death, life, and beyond. At this point in the narrative of the scriptures, the dominion of death has just entered the scene. The handmaiden of death, sin, the cruel slave master, holds all humanity, and through them the entire cosmos, captive. All the nefesh belong to the cosmic tyrant. The dust creatures will be swallowed up by the dust eater, as Adonai lamented in Genesis 3. That raises several questions. What does it look like for the devil to claim those who belong to him? What does that mean? Where do they go? What hope, if any, does Adam have to escape from the clutches of that cosmic tyrant? Does life continue or end after death? That is why I think the term after death makes more sense here. Because, as we'll see, it's hardly a life at all. It's rather simply just an extension in the spiritual realm of the deathly state of the earthly realm. So, come join me in exploring these topics together. And the first question is, what is life? To briefly recap what we saw in Genesis 2, Adonai formed Adam out of the dust of the earth, breathed into the dust creature the breath of life, and then planted Ha-Adam in the garden to work and keep it. Whilst there, Adam was able to partake of the tree of life. So long as they did, they would remain connected to their source of life, Adonai himself, in the person of Christ. They would be functionally immortal, while not being immortal by nature. Only Adonai alone is immortal, as Paul tells us in 1 Timothy. All of this tells us that life means connection to life itself. The Hebrew term nefesh means living being, and it describes anything, animal, human, even perhaps plant, that is animate, active, and alive. That is why the term is sometimes translated living soul, because the Latin term for soul is anima, where we get our word to animate. Ha-Adam became a nefesh, in order that the Tselem of Adonai might properly reflect in its own life the life of the life-giver. We also see in this Genesis 2 picture that Adam is a kind of hybrid creature, unique among the nefesh. We see none of the other nefesh given the personal and intimate attention of Adonai, either in shaping their form with his own hands, nor in breathing his own breath into them. In Adam, we see the bringing together and joining of heaven and earth, spiritual and physical, seen and unseen. That is why some scholars call human beings a mini-cosmos. Humans are, in their very being, a joining together of heaven and earth, just like Eden is. That is why the life which the Tselem of the Heavenly Father possesses has both elements, heavenly life and earthly life. Both are sustained by their connection to the source of life, but in unique ways that are different from the other nefesh. Or, to put it another way, human nature is an undifferentiated mixture of the two natures. One higher, or rational or spiritual, one lower, animal. When life leaves the body, this mixture is denatured, to borrow a chemistry term. The spiritual, rational part of an Adam returns to God from whence it came, while the animal part of Adam returns to the dust from whence it came. This is discussed in places like Ecclesiastes 12:7, Job 34:14 and 15, and the death cries of both Christ and St. Stephen, committing their spirit to the hands of Adonai. Life, then, means to be with the Father and the Son, connected to them as the source of life. This is more than just life in the physical body, as Christ tells us in Luke's Gospel. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living, for to him all are alive. Luke 20:38. The life of the Spirit continues beyond the life of the body. And what does that disembodied life look like? Frankly, we have very few indicators at all in either scripture or tradition, and in fact, we often find what could potentially be seen as admonitions to not look behind that veil. For metaphysical reasons that are far too complicated to get into here and now, I'm not even sure that disembodied is the best way to refer to that intermediate state. About the only indicator we have is that it is temporary. When Christ returns, the spirits of all men will return to their renewed bodies, which are reconstituted not according to the animating principle of psyche, soul, but according to pneuma, spirit. This is what Paul talks about at length in 1 Corinthians 15. The mortal will put on immortality. The perishable will put on imperishability. The psyche animated body is weak and falls short of honor, glory. The pneuma animated body is powerful and filled to overflowing with honor and glory. Both bodies are material bodies, as Paul says throughout that passage. The one lives its life in the likeness of Adam, psyche. The other lives its life in the likeness of Christ, the life-giving capital P, pneuma, or spirit. The material of the psychological body is subject to decay and corruption, under the rule of the dominion of death and belonging to the cosmic tyrant. The material of the pneumatic body is freed from that subjection and dominion. And that is the segue into discussing death and returning to Genesis. What is death in the ancient imagination? Adonai warns Ha-Adam that on the day they eat of the tree of knowing, they will surely die. The Hebrew construction there is fascinating. The text reads, mut tamut, which is an infinitive followed by an imperfect of the same root word. It is doubled up. Bible scholar Tim Mackey shorthands this as Adonai saying, you will die. Other translations have, you will die by death, or you will die the death. The latter is the preferred construction of the church fathers for whatever that's worth. I believe that this picture is saying, essentially, death will kill you. If Adam eats of the tree of knowing before they were ready, death itself will grab hold of them and cut them off from the source of life. Adonai, as we noted in previous episodes, is not warning them of what he will do to them. He is warning them that there is a shadowy figure out there, crouching and ready to pounce on them and devour them. They will be swallowed up by death if they heed that voice and not his voice. And we all know how that turned out. That is what death means in the ancient imagination, to have one's spirit be imprisoned by the Lord of death in the realm of death. You might have heard a distinction sometimes being made between spiritual death and physical death. That distinction, while not explicit within the text of Genesis, I think is entirely valid from the text of Genesis. But we tend to swing between two extremes when we think of this, either as closeted materialists where physical life and death is the real thing and the spiritual stuff doesn't really matter as much, or as closeted Gnostics, where spiritual life and death is the real thing and the physical stuff doesn't really matter. In my opinion, the biblical picture is neither of those extremes. The biblical picture, as I read it, is saying that both matter, the physical and the spiritual. Physical death is not something that was envisioned or desired as part of the goodness of creation. Spiritual death is the ultimate insult to that ontological injury. Quite literally, as the text says, on the day they ate of it, they died the death. Mut tamut. What does that mean? That their spirit, the gift from the giver of life, now has an ontological claim laid against it by death itself, because they have chosen to give that gift up to the spiritual personification of death. The Hebrew word there shares linguistic associations to the name of the god of death in the Semitic worldview, Mot. This same word is used in the prophet Hosea when he says, "O death, Mot, where is your victory?" A passage St. Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 in talking about the victory over death itself, through the undoing of this Adamic abrogation of life. So that's what dying you will die means in Genesis 2. By listening to the voice of death, you will hand over your life to death itself. Your spirit will be subject to the Lord of death and be imprisoned by him in the realm of death. If this is giving you serious Greek mythology vibes, with Hades being both the god of death and the name of the realm of death, congratulations, you get an ancient Near East cookie. Greece, as the last ancient Near East culture, shares the same metaphysical and theological instincts as Mesopotamia. That is why their description of after-death sounds remarkably similar to the Semitic one we find in the Bible. In the ANE worldview, the realm of the dead was referred to as Sheol and is roughly analogous to Hades. It was described as being the lower regions and down in the belly of the earth. We see this in Genesis 37 through 44, where it appears like this several times in the incidents between Jacob and Joseph. In Numbers 16, a crack opens up in the earth and swallows up the rebellious Korahites who go down alive into Sheol. This picture continues throughout the book of Job and the Psalms in particular, and you'll see it variously translated as the grave, the pit, or, again, only in the KJV, hell. That last one is particularly unfortunate, as the idea of hell simply does not equate to the Hebraic image of Sheol. Sheol is a shadowy, dark, gloomy, silent, and somber place where all the dead go. The righteous and the unrighteous alike end up in Sheol in the Bible. This is made explicit in Psalm 89, where it says, "What man can live and not see death? Can he deliver his soul from the power of Sheol?" In Isaiah 5, we see the personification of Sheol as a gaping mouth, ready to swallow up all life. Sheol has enlarged its throat and opened its mouth without measure. Proverbs takes the same line. Sheol and Abaddon are never satisfied. 27:20. So what is Abaddon? This is the abyss, or Tartarus in Greek. In the Greek myths, this was the deepest, darkest prison of the underworld, where the Titans were imprisoned. In the Semitic imagination, it was a realm associated with the chaos monsters, Leviathan and Behemoth. And in the Book of Enoch, we see that the rebellious Watchers from Genesis 6 are imprisoned there. Two prominent figures who appear in the scriptural text, albeit elsewhere than Genesis, associated with that location are Azazel and Apollyon. The first is the spiritual being who is declared in 1 Enoch as the one to whom we should ascribe all sin, and to whom a goat is exiled bearing all the sins of the people on his shoulders in Leviticus 16. We normally call this a scapegoat, but frankly I love Roy Gaines' terminology here, tote goat. This is a symbolic garbage truck, loading up all the sin trash and taking it to the dump outside the camp. Or, as one of my friends online put it, dropping the flaming bag of poo at the devil's doorstep. Gotta love that image. Apollyon is the Greek word for destroyer, and describes a figure that we can only describe as a kind of rabid dog angel of death. This spiritual being appears in Revelation 9:11 as the king of the abyss, and seemed to, at one point, hold the key to the abyss, which seems partly like he is a kind of left hand of God figure. These are the images of the spiritual beings who are said to be tied to the afterdeath, the one who is responsible for populating the abyss, and the one holding the keys to, symbolizing power over, the abyss. This can be conceived as a chamber or pit within the pit itself, Sheol or Hades, associated with Mot, the god of death. This is part and parcel of the dominion of death we have been discussing in Genesis 3 so far. All life is subject to the claims of Sheol, because the images and co-rulers of Adonai abrogated their authority and handed it over to the god of death. Hence, all life goes down into Sheol. This is pictured as a realm below the earth, but it is important to remember that this is what we might call cosmic geography. This is not literal longitude and latitude, but a spiritual realm that overlaps with the physical realm. Honestly, the best way to picture this might be like the upside down in Stranger Things. Our world, but inverted on a spiritual dimension. This gets expressed as down, not because ancient people were nothing more than primitive dum-dums who didn't understand like we enlightened people do that there is nothing but molten rock down below. Instead, it gets expressed as down because it is an apt description of the phenomenological experience of it all. People go down into the earth and are never seen or heard from again. Except sometimes they are. We see evidences of communing with the dead, even the righteous dead, as the witch of Endor does with Samuel for King Saul. But when they do, there is no sense that the afterdeath is much better for them than it is for anyone else. It is only in the intertestamental period where we see the development of deuterocanonical literature, such as the Book of Enoch, that depicts a chasm separating the righteous and the wicked within Sheol, where there is some water and some light on the one side and none on the other. This is where we get the concept of Abraham's bosom, and it is this imagery that Jesus draws from when he tells the story, or perhaps parable, of the rich man and Lazarus. This notion of Abraham's bosom is built off of a vague sense in the Genesis narrative that the spirits of the righteous dead abide together. Adonai himself tells Abram something like this in Genesis 15, that he will go to his fathers in peace and be buried at an old age. Jacob, when he is dying in Genesis 49, says that he is about to be gathered to his people. That is the faint hope of the Old Testament. Not only that there is something better within the confines of the grave, but that in the end Adonai will redeem and ransom the captives of Mot, Sheol, and Hades. David holds to this belief in Psalm 16. you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, a passage that the New Testament later picks up on as a messianic hope. Again in Psalm 49, we hear, Adonai will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol. The ultimate hope, at least the one directly referenced by Jesus, is that of Jonah's experience in the big fish, which is more than likely a reference to the great sea serpent Leviathan. From the belly of this chaos creature, Jonah prays, I cried for help from the depths of Sheol. You heard my voice. 2:1. This is the passage Jesus cites when the people ask for a sign that he is the Messiah. He says that no sign will be given them other than the sign of Jonah, a descent into Sheol, and a subsequent emergence unto life. As that chapter of Jonah ends, it says, Adonai commanded the fish, and it vomited Jonah up onto dry land. At the voice of Adonai, all spiritual beings must obey and relinquish all their captives. That is the sign of Jonah which the Messiah gives to all, the submission of Sheol and the defeat of death. The image which the Old Testament paints is that of life in the dominion of death, under the curse on the earth, slaving under the rule of the devil and all the forces of darkness, with bodies subject to Sheol and moat. The image the New Testament paints is that of life in the dominion of the Messiah, who rules in the midst of his enemies, as Psalm 110 states the Messiah will do. Death is not yet fully abolished. The demons are not yet fully destroyed. D-Day has happened, and the Messiah has landed on the shores of cosmic geography Normandy. The powers of darkness are on the run, in retreat, burning and pillaging as they go. Despite this, the Messiah now rules, having dealt to death its death blow by his death. I have always resonated with the poetry of English poet John Donne, and I want to read one of his holy sonnets, number 10, which captures this image well. Death, be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure, then from thee much more must flow. And soonest our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and souls delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell, and poppy or charms can make us sleep as well and better than thy stroke. Why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. This image of the death of death is part of what constitutes the hope expressed by the Old Testament prophets, and finds its fulfillment in Israel's Messiah. This is the vision of Psalm 24, which depicts the victory of the Messiah over Hades and all its devilish denizens. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is the King of glory? The Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. The fulfillment of this vision occurs in the Apocalypse of St. John, which we call the Book of Revelation. It describes Christ standing in the midst of the divine council and saying, Do not be afraid. I am the first and the last, and the living one. And I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of death and of Hades. 1:17-18. This is the afterdeath, to which we now, in the Messianic age, can look forward to. So, explain it to me like I'm 5. Okay, ready? Life is when we are united to God and move in His being. Death is when we are separated from God and enslaved by another being. The prison of Sheol was for all the sons of Adam, until the true Adam could trample down death by death. I hope that this examination of life, death, and the afterdeath has been helpful for you. Not just helpful for the left brain rational side of your soul, but also for the right brain connection side of your soul. These are shadowy and maddeningly unclear references, for sure. I think that this should tell us that the emphasis of the scriptures simply isn't on the things we have as a question in our heads. We want to know all about what happens when you die, and the scriptures simply refuse to answer most of the time. When they do answer, they give low-resolution hints and veiled images of realities beyond our ability to fully comprehend. I think that this principle is incredibly important when we are wrestling with our understanding of God, humans, and the purpose of life. The focus of the scriptures simply is not, do you know where you're going to go when you die? It is more like, what can you do right now to bring the life of heaven to the death we find here on earth? Because there is plenty of death to be found all around us. And that is my challenge to you today. To go out into the death which you find in the world around you and fill it with life. Our royal inheritance as the Selim of Adonai is to bring the life of heaven onto earth. I encourage each of you to work on that vocation. I have been reading a lot of Dr. Timothy Petsisis' work on the ethics of beauty and how vitally important that is to the healing of the soul. So, find ways to flood your soul with beauty. Plant a garden. Soak in the squeals of delight from your child. Watch a bird from your window. Sit in the cool autumn breeze and feel your goosebumps prickling on your skin. Commit to saying the Lord's Prayer or the Jesus Prayer 40 times in a day. Go to a liturgical church building and take in the iconography and the incense. Brick your phone and do solid manual labor, etc. Then take that wellspring of beauty and bring it into the world that still labors under the belief that it is enslaved to death. Give alms to a charity that brings healing and light. Pray for the well-being of every person you make eye contact with in a day. Say something kind and generous and edifying to someone who misunderstands you. Bring a bag of toiletries with you in your car and give it to an unhoused person. Ask an enemy how you can serve them, etc. Every bit of life and light in the world comes from above, from the Father of lights and the Lord of life. If you are a follower of Christ, this goes double for you. Trample down demons with your acts of love and mercy. Laugh at and be thankful to God for your own poverty and want. Sneer at and mock the devil by forgiving anyone who wrongs you, and live in constant conviction of the death of death. And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at Church Kid Pod, and on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. This podcast is hosted through Podbean, so you can find the HQ for all podcast content on churchkidpod.podbean.com. There you will find links to all the major podcast apps you can find me at, as well as notices and other important information. I know that every podcast asks you to do this, but it's especially important as we get started and get the word out there. Please take a minute to subscribe to this podcast on your preferred platform so that you never miss an episode. But also, and more importantly, if you love the content or find it valuable, please give it a 5-star rating. That is really the only way that the algorithms will give me any respect. And without those sweet 5-star ratings, no one will be able to find this content. If you think I haven't earned a 5-star rating, feel free to message me on social media at ChurchKidPod, and I will see what I can do. I'm always happy to get good, constructive feedback and to improve wherever I can. No matter what your story is, no matter where you come from or where you are, I want to pray for you from the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians, chapter 3, verse 19. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.